But thinking about guarantee, assurances, even a warranty. I was once duped by a guarantee. In college, I decided to spend an exorbitant amount of money on a flat screen TV, and I mean, oh, it was pretty. It was nice. It was, especially for me, a 40-inch flat screen TV was a lot, and it was great. And I even bought the surround sound, and oh, it was wonderful. Everybody was envious of what I spent this money on. And as I was getting ready to finish everything up and finish purchasing this TV, the salesman who led me to this TV said, you know, for an extra $200, you can have extended warranty. And I thought, oh, that's all? Well, that's about half of what I'm paying for all this, or at least a third of it, but ooh, I like that. And as he continued, he said, you know, it will cover 4 years of protection. I mean, hardware issues, to spilling your coffee on the TV, everything will be covered. All you have to do is bring the TV in, and we'll give you another TV equal to the value what you pay for today. And I thought, that means if 3 years from now, something were to happen to the TV, I would get an even better TV. Because if I'm spending, say, $500 on this one, well, surely I can get an even better TV because of the advancement of technology. You know, you try to reason with yourself why this is a good deal. And so he said, yeah, just sign for it. And oh boy, I did. About 2 years go by, and I've graduated from college, and I'm moving my TV around. And in fact, I had a couple of teens. I was a youth minister. I had a couple of teens coming by, so I was setting the TV up in my office so we could watch a movie. And as I was moving it, it slipped in my hand and fell right on the corner of my desk. Was I worried? Oh no. I have bought the extended warranty. I thought to myself, I'm so grateful. And boy, I loaded that cracked TV up, and it looked just kind of like this. I loaded it up in the back of my little car, and I drove right to the store, and I said, I need a new TV. And boy, they were happy to help until I brought out the old TV. And I said, I bought this extended warranty. I had the papers and everything. And they said, sir, that warranty doesn't cover accidental damage. And I said, can I see your manager? And sure enough, I didn't check the fine print. It only covered the hardware malfunctions. That guy had sold me a lie. And he did it on purpose, probably for commission. I'm not sure. But my little 23-year-old heart was broken. How could anybody in the business lie to somebody, a customer? That doesn't seem like good business. Well, I thought about that idea of guarantee. You know, the idea of a promise, it's so reassuring. The guarantee just makes us feel so comfy that to have this security. But what happens when the security isn't what you thought it was? That's the issue. See, because with a promise, it's not so much what is being said as who is saying it. You know, I can make you all the different kind of promises, and I can give you the best, the brightest warranty. But if I am not a person of my word, those phrases don't mean anything. And it's sad that we've gone from a culture where really just your word and a handshake will do to getting really a group of attorneys to read these documents to make sure that there isn't a loophole in the system of what you're signing. I mean, even just thinking about the idea that I'd have to pay for peace of mind, that's a shame. And I understand why they have to pay for the warranty in case someone could just go and break their TV to get a new one, but it's sad that's how our world operates. I'm thinking about what we've been talking about. We just started last week on a better faith. And we've been looking at the book of Hebrews, and the author of Hebrews, he's trying to reassure these Christians who used to be Jews that they've gone through this persecution, this suffering, and they're contemplating reverting to Judaism. They're thinking about, well, I didn't have this kind of struggle over there, and that religion was much more tangible. You know, we were offering sacrifices, and we were having this cleanliness, and it just seems different. He was trying to reassure them that no, you have a better faith today than you had back then. And last week we looked at the covenant, a better covenant, and that word, what that word meant to us and how it helps us. It's our foundation for our faith. Tonight I want us to look at another word, promise. We have a better promise in Jesus Christ today than this world has ever known. The word promise is used about 18 times in the book of Hebrews, and it's another key word to the book. That through Jesus we have this great promise in God, and we're going to understand that because of His death and His sacrifice and His resurrection, we have a better hope. And that is what we're going to be looking at in Hebrews chapter 6. If you want to look there with me now, we're going to start reading here in just a few moments about having this hope which is an anchor for the soul. Well, let's read together, and we're going to look at this better promise. Beginning at verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of His purpose, He guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have the strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Looking at this idea of this promise, I want us to first notice really this heavenly promise, and we begin with verse 13. And so what this author is doing is he's reminding these Christians of their ancestry, of the promises that they've heard before, specifically when it came to Abraham. And so as we look at this promise, as we understand how we have a better promise today, we first want to see the source of the promise. What is it exactly that makes this promise for Christians so much better than what the Jews had in the Old Testament? Was it that well, God is more dependable now than He used to be? Absolutely not. And that is what this author is doing. He's building this argument about how you can trust the source of the promise. Well, let's rewind. Let's look back at what God is doing with Abraham. And really, when you go all the way back before Abraham's name was even Abraham, when it was Abram, and he's living with his father in this pagan land, God approached Abraham, and he told him in Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses, how He was going to make Abraham great. How He's going to make this man Abram into Abraham. How He's going to be a father of many nations even in his old age. And that through his seed, through his children, all nations were going to be blessed. Well, that sounds like a good deal. Well, time went on. Time passed. And Abraham needed some reassurances. In fact, as you look through the story of Abraham, really from Genesis chapter 12 through chapter 21 or so, Abraham struggles with this promise, with the son of the promise. In fact, he finds himself at odds and in trouble from time to time, and God has to kind of come back in and reassure Abraham. Well, then the son of the promise comes, and everything is great, and everything is just so perfect. And then God calls Abraham to sacrifice his son. And you think, God, I've waited 25 years for your word to come true, and now it's come true. You're telling me to give up what you promised me? Are you reneging on your promise, or was this some kind of big cosmic trick? Well, of course, we understand that Abraham trusted in God, and right before he struck that killing blow, God stopped Abraham, and He saw Abraham's priorities and his trust in God, and He offered Abraham another sacrifice. So then we get to Genesis chapter 22, and really back in verse 15 through verse 17, we see this concept spoken of in Hebrews 6 about God making this oath. We see it in this passage, Genesis 22:17. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heavens and the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. We see that God is always true to his word. And again, he reaffirms his covenant with Abraham because Abraham has obeyed God's voice. But what I love in chapter 22, God swore by himself. And then we read in Hebrews 6, God swore by himself. Why did God swear by himself? And you think about what is being done with an oath. The idea of the oath is the idea that if I'm trying to convince you that I'm going to do something for you, I swear by someone who is in a higher position of authority than myself who will guarantee that what I say will come to pass. It can be that you loan me a bunch of money and I'm going to repay you in so many months. I swear by the court or I swear by whomever, by the bank, I will pay for it. And now that bank or that court or even just another person, they have the responsibility to make sure I follow through with my word. Well, what we see is the idea of this oath is you swear by someone greater than yourself. And since there is no one greater than God, there is no one who surpasses God's power, his wisdom, his might, his majesty, or his love. He had to swear by his own name. And you think about the idea, Abraham, he probably made an oath to God and say, I swear on behalf of God that I will follow your word. And God over here, and he says, well, I swear on my own name that I will do what I say I'm going to do. Does that make sense? That God really had no one higher, no one greater than himself, so he swore by his own character, by his own nature, by his own glory, that what he said was going to happen. Imagine taking that kind of oath. And so because of this oath, we read in verse 15, and thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. See, in this day and age, God made a promise to Abraham. He later reaffirmed it with an oath by his own name that this was going to happen. And because of it, Abraham patiently waited. Despite the struggles, despite the afflictions, despite the family squabbles, Abraham trusted in God. And he obtained the promise. Now this is where we need to focus on tonight, the idea that God is not only always true to his word, but that he does certain things to reassure his people. Because you have to ask yourself, well, I get what you're saying about swearing an oath, but if he's just swearing by his own name, then what's the purpose? What's the importance of this oath? I mean, after all, I remember reading, I believe it's in Matthew, and it's in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, well, don't swear at all. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything greater than this or outside of this is from the evil one. It's evil. Why is it that God is making an oath when Jesus himself said, oh, you shouldn't make oaths? Well, here's the reason. The context is, people would make oaths swearing by higher parties that they're going to do something and they were held responsible by that party. And well, at this day and age when Jesus spoke these words, people were making lesser oaths. We talked about this in Bible class a couple times, but what they would do is they would say, oh, I swear by the city of Jerusalem, I will do this thing. But the caveat is, if you're not facing Jerusalem, it doesn't count. That's how they would make their oaths. And so they would try to find, kind of like this guy with this warranty, they kind of find their loopholes and they say, well, by the throne of David. But if I don't do a certain thing here, it doesn't count. And I made the equivalent of crossing your fingers, putting behind your back, and making a promise. And that's why Jesus is saying, just be known as a person of your word. You don't have to put a cherry on top of whatever you're promising to make it valid. Just do it. So why did God make the oath? God didn't have to make the oath for himself, because in his own nature it is impossible for God to lie. God cannot lie. We read this in verse 18. it is impossible for God to lie. In fact, you can go to Titus chapter 1, verse 2 and read that God cannot lie. So we see in verse 16 of Hebrews chapter 6, the reason why people make oaths is so that in all their disputes, the oath is final for the confirmation. This settles it. I'm putting not only my trust in a higher party, but I'm putting the responsibility toward them. So why did God do it? God did not make the oath for His benefit. Rather, it was for our benefit. See, because we in this story, in this passage, really in this covenant, we're the skittish ones who need the guarantees. I think about how God often describes humanity, and one of the greatest, yet one of the most humbling ways, is by being sheep. Sheep are skittish, they're impulsive, really they're not too bright. And this is how God sees us. And I think about the idea of how sheep are skittish and how we are skittish. And I think about how Abraham, throughout his waiting, I mean 25 years. Imagine making a promise to someone. They'd probably get upset if you haven't fulfilled it in a week. Waiting for God, and you're getting older and older, and you see your spouse, and she's going through the same thing, and you're both kind of looking at each other every morning. Is it going to be today? Is it going to be next week? God didn't speak to Abraham every day. In fact, it's possible multiple years went by between God's conversation and then the second one. And so it's possible weeks went, and they're thinking, maybe God's forgotten about me. So as we look and we see this idea of this, the importance behind the oath is that it was to reassure the recipients, the heirs of His promise. In verse 17, God, He desired. He had a desire for what? To reassure us. He had a desire to bring us comfort. Those who were the heirs of the promise, the recipients of what He had chosen to give to them, when He desired to convince us even more. So that tells us again, it's not that God was not dependable, it's that we weren't dependable, that we were hesitant, or that we struggled, or that when we face the realities of life, we began to think, is God really there for me? God, in a more convincing fashion, swore by Himself. And He's shown us His unchangeable nature of His purpose, and He guaranteed it. So that there are these two unchangeable things. What are the two unchangeable things? Well, first, it's His initial word. It's His initial promise saying, this is going to happen. And then the second unchangeable thing is that it is His oath. By swearing by Himself, He's saying that if I do not do this, I am not worthy for you to serve. I am not the God that I say that I am if this does not come to pass. He did that for us. He did that for Abraham. And as we see through the eyes of Abraham the temptation or the doubt, it's truly a reflection of our own heart today. So God gave this heavenly promise that even though in His own nature He cannot lie, He further affirmed for us the purpose, the quality of who He is. See, when we look at His guarantee, we see that He cannot lie. We find consolation in the foundation of what He spoke to us. Okay, so this is all well and good. God's promise to Abraham came to fruition. We can read that in the past, but what is that for us today? Well, for today, we have an even greater promise, and the greater promise is not in the one who makes the promise. It's not that He's become more dependable versus how He was back in the Old Testament, as though God has changed. Rather, it is the substance of the promise. What God is promising for us today is of even a greater worth than what God had given to Abraham. See, God had given to Abraham the promise of a physical son. And through this physical son, a nation would be born. And through this physical nation, all the earth will be blessed. And truly we see the blessing of Israel upon the world. But specifically, Genesis 12, I believe, is talking about Jesus. That Jesus came through the line of David. And because of Jesus, all are blessed. And now we have a substance of even greater worth. The promise God makes to us today is even greater. Again, not in the fact that He's more dependable, but in the substance of the promise. And anyone who might convert, and that's what we're talking about in Hebrews, anyone who's kind of thinking, I'm kind of leaning back to the way things used to be, the author's saying, don't do it. Because what you're doing, what you're saying is that God's promise is not enough for you. And anyone who reverts back to the way things used to be, they're charging God with a double lie. They're saying that He is not dependable, that His promise does not mean what it says, and that His oath is perjury. Again, like the idea of the warranty with the TV, that the guy really kind of tricked me. And when I signed that warranty, I didn't really understand what he was saying because he deceived me. So if we're saying, well, we're going to kind of slip back into the way of the world or in the way of Judaism or the way things used to be, we're saying God's promise isn't enough. That God has duped me and that His oath meant nothing. See, we have an even greater promise in Jesus. See, we can take refuge. Did you see that in verse 18? We have not just walked, we haven't just run toward the refuge. We have fled. We have searched for the true hope, for the true security, for the true safety in who God is. And now that we are here, why would we ever leave? God has given us strong encouragement through Jesus the Christ that we can hold fast to the hope that is set before us. And if you remember, months ago we talked about hope. In Bible class we talked about hope. I'm going to give you the definition again. Hope is not wishful thinking. It is confident expectation in God's divine promises. I have confidence. I have expectation. I have assurance that what God says is going to happen. And that is why we have this anchor. It is sure. And it is steadfast. Well, what that means is that it is stable. It is something that we can depend on. Nothing can dislodge our hope, for it is the objective reality to anyone who belongs in Christ. It is this assurance in the eternal nature and character of God who does not fault and He does not fail, and what He says will come to pass. It is like an anchor, so that whenever we face the storms of life, we have assurance that our souls will not drift aimlessly. Because we have a greater forerunner. The idea of a forerunner, by the way, is one who is kind of like a scout. They went ahead of the army and they kind of checked out the area that the army is about to overcome, that they're about to conquer. And you think about the book of Numbers, how these 12 spies were sent out for 40 days to survey the land, and they came back, and only 2 of them really believed that God could lead His people to victory. Well, we have an even greater forerunner. We have an even greater scout, someone who's already gone before the throne room of God, Jesus Himself. Because when we read in verse 19, this hope, this confidence, this assurance has entered into the inner place behind the curtain. In the days of the tabernacle, in the days of the temple, only a select few could even go into the temple itself, the temple proper, and then only one person, one time a year, could go in the holiest of holies. So only at that one time a year did God have interaction, true interaction with His people when it came to sin and sacrifice, which we'll look at next week. But this new forerunner, this new scout, this new hope, He went for us through the veil to the throne room of God. And He's come back. See, Jesus not only offered His life at Calvary, but He came back from the grave to reassure us with a greater promise. Hebrews 10, 19 and 20. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way. It's not a dead way. It's not an old way that's about to become obsolete. It is a new and living way that He has opened for us. That what Jesus did was for our benefit, for our gain, through the curtain that is through His flesh. That really gives a whole new meaning to when Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. That is by His death that we can now approach the throne room of God. As it is written in Hebrews 7:22, by His sacrifice, Jesus became a much better guarantee of the covenant. He is our warranty. He is our insurance. He is a better pledge of the new eternal promises. He's not only a high priest of a better order than the Levitical priesthood, but He's a better sacrifice than anything that had been offered before Him or would be offered after Him. He is all we need. So what's the purpose? As we close tonight, you might be saying, what's the purpose, preacher? Okay, we talked about promises. Abraham was in there somewhere. I don't really know why you brought him up. And then, of course, we see Jesus. So why are we talking about promises today? Previously in chapter 6, if we were to go back to verse 1 through about verse 8, we would see that another warning was given. Do you remember in the last week we saw the warning in Hebrews chapter 2 about drifting away, that there's no other greater salvation that's going to be offered? Well, in Hebrews 6, something similar is offered, that if you truly fall away from God, you don't have any assurance in eternal life, because there's not going to be another covenant. There's not going to be another New Testament. There's not going to be another sacrifice. So that's it. And that gets kind of scary. And you begin to think to yourself, well, wait a minute, what if I'm falling away? What if I've fallen away? And so in chapter 2, the author is warning the people about being too passive, about drifting away. Well, now it seems like the other end, the other extreme could be taking place, that we've gone from being passive to being paranoid. And we're lying asleep, or we're lying, when we should be asleep, we're lying awake at night and thinking, do I have any assurance? And we sing something like, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. And I think about the idea of this greater guarantee. See, because when we read in verse 9, though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things that belong to salvation. For God is not unjust as to overlook your work, and that the love that you have shown for His name in serving the saints as you still do. And we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. See, we're given better assurance. And we see the word mentioned for the first time, beloved. It's a word of affection. And the author is saying, I don't feel this way about you. I think that you are serving the kingdom. And you need to maintain your service. God is not unjust to forget your labor. He knows what you've done in the past, and He knows what you continue to do. Just continue to persevere. Continue bearing the fruit. Continue to be diligent. Continue to be driven toward the hope that is set before you. Because God has assured you just as He did to Abraham, and Jesus has confirmed the promise to the end. So here's the question. Is our faith sluggish? Another word for sluggish in the Bible is dull. Or is it a purpose-driven faith? Is it a determined faith? Is it an intentional faith? Because if the covenant is the foundation for a better faith, then the promise is the fuel for the better faith. It is what motivates us. It is what pushes us. It is what causes us to endure. But only those who endure, those who persevere, will inherit the promises. Therefore, we must imitate the men and women of faith who have gone on before us, as we read about in Hebrews chapter 11 and the cloud of witnesses in chapter 12. So let's bear fruit worthy of the promise set before us, of the hope that's secure within us, of the home in heaven waiting for us, of the God who died for us. Let's be earnest. Let's strive. Let's be determined because we see far ahead in the heavenly country, God's promise will be fulfilled. If you're not a child of God this morning, understand God's promise is also meant for you. By turning your life over to Christ, by being baptized in His name, you'll be given the same promise. It'll be the same type of warranty. You'll have the same value of the eternal inheritance. Jesus guarantees it. But if you're a child of God tonight and you've just struggled, perhaps you've been slipping back into the way you used to live, perhaps you've been struggling with your dedication to God, understand God's promise is still alive today. That Jesus secures that promise for you and me. And if you have any prayer requests, if you have sin in your life, if you have temptation on your heart, if you need anything at all, why not turn it over to the one who guarantees you forgiveness and comfort and hope? If you need anything at all tonight, don't hesitate. Come now while we stand, while we sing.